for reaching out and giving me the opportunity to speak.
All right, Steve,
It's really my pleasure to be here with all of you to help celebrate Juneteenth. As Steve mentioned, my name is Chris Spraker. I'm the head of the Historical Special Collections Department at the Harvard Law School Library. And I also want to mention that I grew up in Billerica, and I spent the first about 2 decades of my life in the town. So my background is both in history and in the archives and library world. And my specific historical area of interest and expertise is the history of early New England. So with that in mind, the topic, like Steve mentioned, that I want to talk to you about today is the history of slavery in colonial Billerica and really Massachusetts and New England more generally. This became a focus and interest of mine while I was in graduate school for history. It started sort of as an off-hand classroom assignment for a course I was taking on the history of slavery in New England. And it sort of morphed from there into a class paper, a pseudo thesis, and then eventually a published article in the Historical Journal of Massachusetts way back in 2014. So my plan is to talk for about 25 minutes about the topic. I'm going to try and keep this fairly high level. And after that, if there's time, I'm happy to answer any questions either now or later on. So before diving into colonial Billerica, I do want to start by talking a little bit about Juneteenth and some of how it connects to slavery in colonial New England. So Juneteenth, as we've been discussing, celebrates the date that the end of the Civil War and freedom for some 250,000 enslaved people was announced in Texas. This was on June 19, 1865, and as we've already discussed a little bit, almost 2.5 years after the Emancipation Proclamation. And we do often think of the Emancipation Proclamation, or at least that's how it's taught, immediately ending slavery, but do remember that it only ended slavery in Confederate states. And in order to be enforced, Confederate forces needed to either be defeated or to stand down. So when the Union Army arrives in Galveston, Texas in June of 1865 and makes the announcement that enslaved Black people in the state were free by executive decree, the occasion really starts to be almost immediately celebrated by the Black community in Texas as a sort of second Independence Day. And here we actually have an image of an Emancipation Day celebration from June 19th of 1900 in Austin, Texas. So from there, the holiday spread slowly out of Texas into other parts of the South and beyond as people migrate throughout the country over the next 1.5 centuries. And yet, up until very recently, Juneteenth was predominantly celebrated by the Black community. In fact, I would wager, as we've kind of discussed and Steve did the poll, that many of us here today, Juneteenth was only really brought into the forefront of our consciousness back in 2021 in the wake of serious racial violence and protests for racial justice that once again swept the United States. And so the question becomes, why is that? Why is it that the only state to recognize Juneteenth as an actual holiday and not just a day of observation prior to the year 2020 was Texas in 1980? And prior to the year 2000, why is it that only 4 states observed the day? And spoiler alert, Massachusetts was not one of them. So the answer, to be blunt and to make a long story short here, is that it did not fit the narrative of white reconciliation between the North and the South that fervently swept through national political and social discourse in the decades immediately following the Civil War. So to quote one of my favorite historians, David Blight, from his sort of seminal book titled Race and Reunion, it was in this world that the civil and political liberties of African Americans were slowly becoming sacrificial offerings on the altar of reunion. So ultimately, like the origins of Memorial Day, which was originally called Decoration Day, Juneteenth was relegated to footnote status and effectively written out of our remembered version of the past, or at least minimized. And this is sort of the angle that I'm going to take as the segue to colonial Billerica's history with slavery. Not simply enslavement itself is the connecting thread, but the question of how the past gets remembered, codified, and then sometimes rediscovered and reevaluated. All right, so back to the map. So Billerica was founded in 1655, as many of us probably know, and had several neighboring towns break away from it during the colonial period. These including Bedford, Carlisle, Tewksbury, and Wilmington. So I'm mentioning this because when we talk about the history of Billerica as it relates to slavery and a town, we're really talking about a much larger land area. So I grew up in West Billerica, only about a mile from the borders of Bedford and Carlisle. And so I spent a lot of time in that neck of the woods, which really included frequent trips to Concord, Lexington, and so forth. So when growing up here, I couldn't help but feel immersed in the history of the region and our colonial past, but it was in many ways a narrow window into the past that I was receiving. Everything I saw and learned sort of started in Plymouth Colony, made a quick pit stop at the Salem witchcraft trials, went on to the American Revolution, and then never looked back. Needless to say, the concept of slavery existing in Massachusetts, let alone my hometown and surrounding areas, never occurred to me while I was growing up. So fast forward back to when I'm in graduate school, I had a class assignment to analyze some primary source material, and I decided to do some historical newspaper database research to see if anything related to slavery in Billerica would pop up. And wouldn't you know, this is the first item that I found. This is an advertisement from the May 9th, 1774 issue of the Boston Gazette, announcing that an enslaved person named Caesar had run away from a man named William Thompson in Billerica. So to say that I was surprised to find this would be an understatement. First off, like I mentioned a moment ago, the idea that slavery had existed in the town at all was surprising to me at the time. I mean, I was taking a course on the history of slavery in New England, so it was probably not as surprising as it once might have been. But still, I had an almost visceral reaction to finding this. Second, the date of May 9th, 1774. We're talking about less than 2 years from the American Revolution, which points to a history of over 100 years of enslavement in Billerica and the surrounding area, just like the rest of New England. So we're not singling this town out. I wanted to know more about who these people were, the people who were enslaved and the people who enslaved them. So the reality is that we do know, or we can learn a little bit about William Thompson and his family as an example, but we know very, very little about Caesar. This, as we'll discuss a bit more, is an all too unfortunate occurrence. When trying to discover information about the lives of the enslaved, if you're lucky, their names show up in a few places, but you really, really have to dig for it. Anyway, we know that Caesar was willed to William by his father Benjamin in 1753. And if you can see it here on the screen, Caesar is described as a boy at this time, so we are almost certainly talking about a child. Prior to his death, Benjamin Thompson was an influential person in the town. He had been a town selectman, a large landowner, and he was actually connected to other enslavers in Boston and Cambridge through blood and marriage. We also know that by 1774, William Thompson was a leading citizen in Billerica. Various publications and documents list him as a large landowner, an agricultural producer, a moneylender, town selectman, representative to the Massachusetts General Court, and a militia colonel. Though it's a bit speculative, we also know that an African-American man named Caesar Holland from Billerica was listed as a soldier in the American Revolution. It was not uncommon for enslaved people to fight in the Revolution, sometimes in place of their enslavers. So stepping back for a moment, I think that most people here would probably agree that when we talk about slavery in the United States, we have a very strong tendency to remember it specifically as a Southern institution, with a strong focus on the 19th century and the lead up to the Civil War. So when we think of slavery as it relates to the North, we tend to almost exclusively think about the legacy of abolitionism. And yet, here I was confronted by hard evidence that this was not always the case. In fact, the connection of Massachusetts to the history of slavery is all around us. And I'd be willing to wager that for most of us, we encounter it and we pass it by on almost a daily basis without ever really knowing or at best thinking very much about it. So take Faneuil Hall, for example. Peter Faneuil enslaved at least 5 people. He amassed a fortune through his inheritance and engaging in the transatlantic trade. And Faneuil Hall, his gift to Boston, is part of that legacy. We could also make a trip over to Medford to the Royal House and Slave Court. These are things that I encounter and think about on a daily basis. But we don't have to really go that far, do we? We could probably throw a stone from right here and hit the plaque dedicated to Billerica's first meeting house on the Common, where the town's first 2 ministers, Samuel Whiting and Samuel Ruggles, both enslaved people. Growing up, I passed by the Joe Blaine house on the Billerica-Bedford border on a regular basis. The house was built around 1713 by Joe Blaine, whose father and grandfather both lived on or around the same area of land, and they enslaved people. So with that said, here are some quick facts about slavery in colonial Massachusetts, just to kind of set the table a little bit. So the first enslaved Africans arrived in the colony in 1638 on board the Desire. This is a ship that's based out of Salem, Massachusetts. Massachusetts was the first colony to actually legalize slavery in 1641. Just think about that. To be specific, a document called the Massachusetts Body of Liberties states that there shall never be any bond, slavery, villanage, or captivity amongst us, unless it be lawful captives taken in just wars, and such strangers as willingly sell themselves or are sold to us. I don't know about you, but that's some creative language in my opinion. We also know that Massachusetts was the early leader in the transatlantic slave trade with regard to enslaving voyages that either originated or were funded by merchants based in the colony. By the end of the 17th century, Massachusetts was surpassed by Rhode Island. We're still talking New England though, and they really dominated the slave trade for the rest of the colonial period. So we know that upwards of 1,000 Native Americans were taken captive and sold into slavery in the West Indies during the 17th century. We also know that there were fewer than 1,000 enslaved Africans in all of New England during the 17th century, but that number jumps to at least 2,700 in Massachusetts alone by 1754. I say at least because this information is based on a census that was put down by the English Crown to tax colonists on their property, in this case, enslaved human beings. Individuals under the age of 16, however, were not counted, and there's evidence that people might have underreported on the census. And actually, we'll talk a little bit more about this in a bit. Finally, chattel slavery and engaging in the slave trade were effectively outlawed in Massachusetts through judicial ruling in 1783. So during this period, there are several enslaved people that are able to successfully sue Massachusetts in Massachusetts courts, and they're granted their freedom. However, there is evidence that slavery continues in the state well past this date. So in terms of the historical narrative about slavery in New England, what happened? So by the beginning of the 19th century, the legacy of slavery in the North starts getting pushed to the periphery, and it's really relegated to footnote status after the Civil War. Again, regional historical narratives develop that focus almost solely on the legacy of abolitionism. And if ever mentioned at all, this insidious myth develops that somehow northern slavery was a much more benign form of bondage than that of its southern counterpart. So when I'm researching Billerica's history and its ties to slavery, this became really apparent. Interestingly, many towns like Billerica in Massachusetts produced these absolutely tome-like town history books towards the end of the 19th century, and primarily written by antiquarian historians. So I decided to take a look at the town histories of Billerica and the surrounding area. And this is how they all mention slavery. And this is all that they mention about slavery. So Henry Allen Hazen's History of Billerica, Massachusetts, 1883. The title pages, this is the copy, a picture from my copy. So it says, a census taken in 1754 brings out the curious fact that Massachusetts had 2,717 slaves. Of this number, Billerica had 8, of which whom 5 were females. That's it. Edward Pride, History of Tewksbury, 1888. Many fail to remember, perhaps never dreamed, that slavery once existed in Massachusetts, the leading state in the great anti-slavery movement. Traces of the peculiar institution may be found in all early New England towns. Tewksbury is no exception. It seems strange to hear of the Kittredge, the Trull, the Hunt, and the Rogers family among the slaveholders. Abram Brown, History of Bedford, 1891. Slavery existed in Bedford as elsewhere, though not as attended with the evils that accompanied the inhuman system in many other parts of the country. Then the History of Chelmsford from 1917 has a very, very short chapter titled Slaves and Witches. So this finally begins to change towards the, this finally begins to change towards the middle of the 20th century as various studies begin to show that chattel slavery and the slave trade actually had a significant impact on the development of the New England economy, particularly its transition from an agrarian to a market-based economy in the late 17th and early 18th centuries. So these studies also show that enslaved people in New England overwhelmingly lived in commercial coastal areas like Boston, Salem, and New Bedford. In fact, by 1754, there were probably well over 1,000 enslaved people living in Boston alone. So historians also begin to show that regardless of whether or not white individuals enslaved people themselves, any merchants who directly engaged in the transatlantic trade during this period were either directly involved in the African and West Indian slave trade, or they directly profited from it. So more recent studies, sort of over the past 2 or so decades, start examining enslavement in more rural Massachusetts and New England communities. Elise Lemire's 2009 book, Black Walden, which I highly recommend, examines the legacy of enslavement in Concord. And it's really probably one of the best micro-studies about these smaller towns that's been written to date, in my opinion. So Lemire argues that enslavement in Concord really corresponded with existing social standing and or ambition for white colonists. Essentially, these were people who were trying to pursue secondary careers other than farming, and they utilized enslaved labor as a means to help escape the farm, and also as a way to signify the social standing of themselves and their families. More than that, her work sort of joined a growing group of new scholarship, showing that far from just being significant in commercial areas, enslavement also contributed to the economic development of more rural communities in Massachusetts. Okay, so finally getting back to Billerica, for my research, I decided to use recent studies like Black Walden as a lens through which to examine the town, to see if the patterns held true, and suffice it to say, they did. So just a little bit about the town's early history with regard to enslavement. Originally known as Shawsheen, Billerica was granted to Cambridge as a large land area in 1643, and as we discussed earlier, incorporated as a town in 1655. About 10 of the town's earliest settlers were enslavers, meaning they either brought enslaved people with them to the town, or they purchased them shortly after arriving. As I mentioned earlier, this included the town's first minister. As far as we know, enslaved people in remote areas like Billerica, remote at the time anyway, would have been almost totally isolated physically and psychologically by their bondage. And their workload certainly would have been heavy as field and household laborers as well as personal servants. So by the first decade of the 18th century, Massachusetts and really all of New England was a world in flux. We have religious, military, economic, and social struggles that are threatening to tear Puritan society apart at the seams for decades. A part of this were new opportunities for economic and social advancement by the burgeoning transatlantic trade. So it's in this world that white landowners in rural areas start becoming connected to new opportunities in information networks that had previously eluded them. It was during this time period that the first newspapers spring up in Boston and Salem, and they make their way inland as well. In these newspapers, goods were listed for sale alongside human beings. So the examples here are actually 2 different advertisements for enslaved people for sale in the same issue of the Boston Gazette from 1774, in which Caesar, from earlier, was listed as a runaway from William Thompson in Billerica. So again, just think about that date for a minute, 1774. We're talking about literally the eve of the American Revolution. So then, much like the rest of Massachusetts, Billerica saw a sharp increase in the number of enslavers and enslaved people living in the town between 1700 and 1755. In fact, as many as 30 enslavers lived in the town during this period of time. Some of these were completely new families and individuals, and others were descendants of existing enslavers in the town and the surrounding area. So 2 different censuses list 8 enslaved people living in the town in 1754. Here's actually the example. This is the sheet for Billerica. And 14 in the 1760s. But as I mentioned earlier, these only counted individuals over the age of 16. And so they are almost certainly undercounts. In fact, we know that there were at least several teenagers and children under the age of 16 enslaved in Billerica in the years right around 1754. Additionally, there's strong evidence that, like Concord and other towns, these enslaved individuals performed much needed labor for their enslavers in the town, allowing them to pursue secondary careers outside of farming, as well as serving as status symbols for wealthy white families. At this point, it's really important to stop and try and talk about who these enslaved individuals were. Unfortunately, in almost all cases, it's nearly impossible to discover, but here is what we do know. First, enslaved people typically only show up in legal documents, like wills, probate records, bills of sale, and like we've seen also, newspaper advertisements. The first image here, and I'm sure you probably can't read it, we have an excerpt from the first page of a Billerica citizen, William Crosby's probate inventory, showing, quote, one Negro boy in the 14th year of his age. This child's name was most likely Robin. We also know that some enslaved people had specialized trades. For example, an enslaved person from Billerica is named William Smith was listed as a tailor by trade in a runaway advertisement from 1735. In only a few instances do we actually get more detailed glimpses into the lives of the enslaved. Here's the best example from Billerica that I have been able to discover. Lydia York was the daughter of Pompey and Dillo York. They were almost certainly also enslaved. She was born in 1730, and she first shows up in the probate inventory of Jonathan Bowers at the age of 14. Lydia had a brother, Samson, in 1732, a sister, Eunice, in 1743. She had at least 3 children, Nellie in 1752, Lydia in 1754, and Anne in 1756. Multiple sources list Lydia as the personal servant of Hannah Bowers, and there's evidence of Hannah Bowers selling an enslaved child right around this time. So Lydia married Saul Sumset in 1777, and then she married Amos Fortune, who was a formerly enslaved person from New Hampshire, and he purchased Lydia's freedom in 1778. Sadly, that's all we know. We also need to ask the question, who were the enslavers in towns like Billerica? Well, like all rural areas in colonial Massachusetts that we know of, enslavers in Billerica, they were a statistical minority. However, they were all either very influential citizens or people with aspirations to become influential beyond farming, or at least to increase the economic and social standing of their families. They typically descended from wealthy and influential families in England, Massachusetts, and other parts of New England, and they often intermarried within the families of other enslavers or families of generally high social standing. Almost every enslaver in Billerica had a secondary career other than farming. There were selectmen, representatives to the Massachusetts General Court, merchants, ministers, etc. Nearly every enslaver in the town also possessed an honorary or military title, Mr., Esquire, Colonel. In most cases, they gave birth to multiple generations of family members who benefited from slave labor in gathering their family fortunes and their networks of influence. So to just close things out, I'm going to read a short excerpt from the article that I published back in 2014 that I think really encapsulates everything really well. So the real impact of slavery in towns like Billerica was how the enslaved helped ensure the sustained success of prominent families over generations. Some children of enslavers chose to purchase or keep formerly enslaved people themselves, while others simply benefited from the wealth and prestige of their families. As graduates from Harvard and Yale, doctors, lawyers, politicians, and leading citizens in Billerica and other towns, they would embody the Yankee middle and upper classes of New England during the decades following the American Revolution. The William Crosby family neatly summarizes slavery's impact in Billerica. William was born in 1697. He's the son of Joseph Crosby and the grandson of Simon Crosby, one of Billerica's earliest enslavers. As one of 12 children, William received 2 very important things from his father: the connections that came with the Crosby family name and a sizable parcel of land. He also purchased additional property from at least 6 other Billerica citizens between 1721 and 1730, thus becoming one of the town's largest landowners. With the need for additional hands to maintain his extensive land holdings, William Crosby utilized the labor of at least 3 enslaved people. Related to his accumulated wealth, Crosby received the title of Mr., which was an honor reserved for prominent individuals who did not possess an honorary or military title. Upon his death in 1754, Crosby bequeathed to his children gifts similar to those he had received from his father, Joseph, namely land, money, influence, and 2 enslaved individuals. Benefiting from the prestige and wealth left to them by their father, his 3 sons, Jessaniah, Hezekiah, and Seth, became leading citizens of Billerica and beyond, eventually producing powerful children of their own. Hezekiah, for example, had a son named William, who graduated from Harvard in 1794 and became a Massachusetts senator representing the District of Maine. This William also had a son named William George Crosby, who became the 23rd governor of Maine, of the state of Maine, and bore the namesake of his grandfather. Governor William Crosby, like other Billerica descendants, was the product of several generations of influential family members, many of whom benefited from enslaved labor in gathering their family fortunes and amassing their networks of influence. Though one could make the argument that these enslavers could have achieved similar success without owning bondsmen, it is a moot point.
The historical fact is they did own them and they benefited handsomely from their labor.
Thank you very much.
Thank
That was
you.
a lot.